That's dead. That's dead. That one is definitely alive. Hi, I'm Jess, and today I'm going to share with you how my Catasetums are doing for this current growing season. So we're leaving behind the dormancy period and we're entering the growing season for these guys. And in my case, a couple of my plants have already started waking up. And I think the largest one has about a 3-inch growth and the rest are slowly coming behind. Roots will be coming shortly afterwards, so it'll be the perfect time to do some maintenance and check on these plants. So I'm going to share with you a couple of things that I do with these plants. So first of all, I want to assess the health. Catasetums during the winter season don't always do well. Sometimes there are problems and issues, and that's kind of part of growing these plants. Some of the plants dried out, they got really dehydrated, all of the bulbs shriveled up, and basically there's nothing left. In that case, those plants needed some water probably a couple of weeks ago. Maybe just a trickle or, just spray here and there just to keep them plump and well watered, but in this case, they just basically dehydrated and dried out. In other cases, the plant kind of started to rot. In that case, it probably had too much moisture and it didn't dry out properly. So the bulb itself got an infection and it died. So that usually happens when it gets too cold and moist in that setup, and that's what tends to happen. Certain hybrids, like ones with more modies or cyanoches in them, also tend to lose pseudobulbs during the winter season. So that's also one of the reasons why some of the plants just didn't do well. And also seedlings tend to be more vulnerable, so some seedlings just didn't make it. When it comes to healthy plants, you don't have to repot them every single year. I have a couple of plants and they've been in their setup for at least a year or 2 or 3 years, and they are fine because the setup is fine, the media is okay, it's growing well, and the new growth is in a place that's beneficial for it. So there's no cause and there's no reason for it to change up the setup, change up the media if everything is going well. So some of my plants are doing fine in their setup. I'm gonna leave them in for another year, see how they grow, add a little bit more fertilizer or top off the media if I need to, and just let it grow. Next is dealing with the plants that are in between, the ones that are not super healthy and the ones that are not dead. So in this case, there's going to be some maintenance that's required, whether it's removing some old bulbs, repositioning the plants, or just figuring out a better way to grow these plants. Then that's where we need to repot these plants. The repotting process is fairly straightforward. You can remove the plant from the pot, you can take away a good portion of the roots and put it in a new setup. Catasetum roots tend to be quite brittle, so they will break anyway if you disturb them severely, especially because they've been dried out for several months already. But that's okay because new growth tends to grow and take over, so it's not imperative to have the old roots, but it definitely helps stabilize the plant. If there's more roots, it can uptake more nutrients, so I like to err on the side of having more roots than less, because then the plants have more to sustain itself. Repotting can be a very traumatic and stressful process for Catasetums, especially if you're removing all of the roots. It definitely weakens the plant. So that's why I try to keep as much root mass as possible. If the plant is potted up in sphagnum moss, I know I'm going to put it back into sphagnum moss. It just does well for me, so I just keep it in that moss setup and it should be fine. I don't have to tease out every single piece of moss. In fact, if the root system looks pretty healthy, then I just wrap the root ball in more moss and then allow the plant to grow. That way I don't have to disturb the root system too much, and allows for the new roots to go into new media. In some cases I've tested out using leca or bark or even coconut husk growing Catasetums, and they can grow well, but it just requires a little bit more watering on my part. In my current setup and environment, it gets pretty dry here and pretty hot, and so moisture loss is very high. And when it comes to leca and bark and even coconut husk, it doesn't retain water as much as sphagnum moss does. And so I find myself watering a lot more often given those conditions, and things tend to dry out more and I have more problems with that than keeping things moist and wet. So if you're in a location where the temperature doesn't get too high or your humidity doesn't dip too low, then you can get away with watering less. And you can use also less moisture retentive media. So after these repots, it's figuring out how to water and when to water these plants. The traditional rule is to have 3 inches of leaves and roots, and that's when you can start gradually increasing the water. I think this holds as a general rule. But in my environment and in my situation, I find that I have to water these plants a little earlier. As you can see, a lot of the pseudobulbs are really wrinkled in the back, and that's because they didn't get water for a long time. I brought my plants outside when I thought all of the rains in Southern California were over and all the storms were over, but basically about a week after I put them outside, it rained for like 2 days, I guess. And I was really worried that the plants would get rot or something would happen with the plants, but it turned out they were okay. In fact, it helped plump up a lot of the bulbs of the plants. I don't think that's something that you need to do. In fact, I think that's probably a mistake on my part leaving them out. But since then, I haven't really been watering these plants. I've kind of been lightly misting it or spraying around it so that it kind of gets the moss a little moist. So it's not super crunchy and dry. The smaller plants have been getting a lot of more moisture, and if I tap on the moss in there, it's a little bit on the softer side versus the larger plants have more crunchy moss on top because it's been dried out a little bit more. But for me, I let the plant be my judge. So if I look at the plant and the back bulbs are desiccating a lot, then I'll give it a little bit of water and it should perk up in a couple of days or give it a week. So usually I don't think it's that big a deal of making a distinct line between when you water and when you don't. It's just kind of gauging what the plant needs. Most of the time the new growth can sustain itself because it's pulling reserves from the back bulb, and the new roots don't really take in new water anyway until it gets a little bit longer. So I don't think like once you see roots you need to water the plant. In fact, I'd want it to actually penetrate the media first before even thinking about adding water. And then when I water the plant, maybe the first couple of days, I just kind of lightly mist it, gradually pour in some water, and then increase the increments so that the moss stays wet. And then once the leaves are fully fleshed out and the roots are penetrating the media, then that's when I would just probably water very heavily. And during the growing season, I can't say that you can water these plants too much. So they take in a lot of water, they take in a lot of heat, and they grow really quick during the growing season. And I don't seem to find any issues with watering too much once you start watering. But I have noticed that there are detriments when you don't water enough during the growing season. And that seems to be more of the issue that I find, is that if it starts to dry out, if you hold back on the water a bit and it gets too dry, then the root tips can start drying off. And then if it gets way too dry, then you start seeing the leaves start getting crispy. Depending on your situation and your environment, you'll have different needs for your plants, and just being able to gauge that is probably the most important thing. I noticed that when I visited the Sunset Valley Orchids hothouse where they store their catasetums, that place gets hot and that place gets humid and that place is pretty unbearable during the height of summer. I know there's fans running and everything, but like if you're in that hothouse, it is pretty intense. And if you have really hot humid conditions, those plants will do perfectly fine in that space. And I think it'll do well in cooler conditions as well. Like I've been growing it here in Southern California. It gets down to 70s on average in the summertime sometimes, and the plants do fine, versus it's in 90 or 100 degree weather. It also does fine. It really just depends on your overall summer temperatures and how you do your watering and all of that. I think the major issues that I find with catasetums tend to be spider mites during the growing season. Like right before you start watering, these plants can get quite dry, or the humidity around that area can be quite dry, and that can attract spider mites. Sometimes snails are also attracted to the moisture in the media, and they can chew on roots if they can get access into the media itself. So those are the kind of primary concerns that I've seen dealing with the growing season of these plants. Catasetums are kind of like feast or famine orchids. Once they start and grow, they need to grow super quick. So they engorge on a lot of nutrients, on water, on light. They need a lot. So if you can provide a lot of heat, a lot of humidity, a lot of water and nutrients, they will grow and do super well during the growing season. And then once it hits dormancy, it kind of goes into fasting mode. And so that's when it stores up all the nutrients, it drops its leaves, it basically looks dead, and you can see the green in the bulbs, then it's definitely still alive. So it'll kind of fast and hold on to its nutrients and hold on to its reserves until it's the growing season again. So in that way, they are kind of low maintenance during its dormancy and then high maintenance during its growing season. At least that's how it is for me. So for this growing season, I'm hoping that all these plants will do well. Then I can share with you some wonderful flowers and some beautiful blooms. but I know that some of these are quite small and they're kind of like seedling size, so I will have to wait a couple of years before they grow and mature. That's the exciting part about these plants, is always learning, always growing, and always adapting to what the plant says and how you can go about giving them what they need. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you want to see more videos about catasetums, please click on the playlist, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye!